Where do we stand in terms of relations between the US and China, particularly as we lead up to these elections in November, and of course as the administration but also Congress weighs up additional action over the Hong Kong security law?
Well, I guess the background to what's happened is that the US and China have now moved from a position of cooperation to one of outright rivalry and competition. So that's the background for the coming presidential election in the United States, where both sides of the presidency, the Republicans and the Democrats, are united on the issue of China. To push back against China, they believe that China is not playing on a level playing field, and that the US needs to push back on all fronts in order to redress the balance. So that's really the context of what's happening, and you have to see Hong Kong in that light.
And Alan, in your recent research that you've published, an in-depth look of the relationship, but also some policy measures that could be put in place to kind of mitigate the worst potential outcomes of this deteriorating relationship, you've talked about the fact that we are now, in your view, at a point where we're looking at a Cold War, a new Cold War between the two powers. The argument against that has always been that you have two economies that are far more interconnected than, of course, the Soviet Union and the US ever were, and that you have people-to-people relations at a much deeper level as well. And also you don't have, and this is an argument that people take issue with, but you don't have China trying to push out and sell a political and economic model to other nations across the world. What is your pushback against some of those arguments?
Yeah, well, my basic argument is that if you look at the parallels with the first Cold War, they are overwhelmingly reflected in what's happening between the US and China now. So the competition between the US and China is not just between two normal great powers, it's a systemic competition across the board. It's partly ideological. There's one between democracy, a leading democracy and a leading authoritarian state. Neither country wants to have a major military conflict, but the risk is that if you have a simmering Cold War and strategic tensions across trade, across tech, geopolitically, the chances of something going wrong and you have military hostilities cannot be ruled out. And in fact, if you look back historically, whenever a rising power like China has challenged an incumbent power, you've had some kind of military conflict. Now, I'm not arguing that's going to happen, but I think the parallels with the first Cold War are overwhelming. The one key difference, and I can see this, is that the US and China are now interconnected in a way the Soviet Union and the US never were. So a lot of people would argue that because of that interdependency, it doesn't make sense for the US and China to get into a really strategic competition leading to military hostilities. But again, I think that can't be ruled out regardless of the fact that the economies are both closely connected. And you can see that now playing out across the world, whether it's in trade, whether it's tech, Huawei, all these sorts of issues now are becoming lightning rods for worsening conflict between the US and China.
Alan, David here. Does anything change if Biden wins in November at all?
I don't think so. In terms of the US core position on China, I think Biden will be just as severe on China as Trump, and in some cases it could be worse for China because the Democrats are more likely to focus on human rights concerns, for example, the Uyghur situation, and human rights more generally in Tibet will become much more of an issue between a Biden-led administration and Trump. So it's quite interesting that China, if it had to choose, well, it will have to choose between the two, would prefer to see Trump re-elected rather than Biden. That tells you a lot.
Now, Alan, you mentioned the interdependence right now of these two economies, and by virtue of that, you have a lot of companies right now pretty much caught in between here, and frankly, a lot of them cannot ignore this anymore. How do you manage your risk as a CEO here? You know, what are the practical steps executives need to do to be able to manage this, which frankly will be around for the next few decades?
Yes, well, look, I think the key point for businesses is that geopolitical risk has become much more important. If you don't understand what's going on in the geopolitical domain, you're not going to be able to make smart business decisions. So it's all about risk management, or de-risking, if you like, your business relationships with Chinese partners. So what looks likely to happen is the US and China are going to decouple their economies in specific sectors, semiconductors, for example, perhaps even financially. And businesses are going to have to be very aware of what the consequences will be for their relationship with both the United States and China. You're going to see a lot more reshoring occurring of US businesses bringing back their production chains into other countries or the United States, and a lot of ring fencing of capacity in the United States as well. So that is going to make it much more difficult to make decisions about business relationships with Chinese partners if you know that the US administration could be, for example, conducting sanctions against Chinese businesses, as is likely to happen in Hong Kong. All those things have to be factored into more of a risk-based approach now to trade with China and the United States.
Alan, how vulnerable is Hong Kong at this point to these potential additional actions from the US?
I think Hong Kong is extremely vulnerable. I think we're at the beginning of the end of the Hong Kong that we've all known. The national security law, which now most of the Trump administration has now had a chance to look at it. You've got legislation going through the United States Congress. Clearly, there are going to be sanctions against Chinese companies that will affect Hong Kong. Financial transactions, as you well know, Hong Kong is the financial gateway to the world for China, and it's also the entry point for a lot of Western business investment in China. That's going to be a lot more difficult in the future, and US-denominated transactions in China in Hong Kong, are going to be much more difficult. So the US is going to probably put a lot of constraints on what China can do in terms of financial transactions in Hong Kong. That will have a very deleterious effect on Hong Kong's position as a unique business hub for China. It's going to become more like the rest of China over time. It's not going to happen immediately, but you can see where this is going in the medium to longer term.